What's one thing about immigration law you wish more people understood but rarely do?
I always say immigration is such a hot topic that people are so strongly opinionated on, but know nothing about. I think a lot of people don't truly understand legal immigration versus illegal immigration.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Backstage Pass with the HR Rockstar podcast, the show that cranks up the volume on HR and talent strategies, leadership, workplace culture, and career insights. Because in today's world, HR isn't just behind the scenes, it's center stage. I'm your host, Jay Arnold, bringing you expert insights, actionable advice, and inspiring stories from rock stars across industries, designed to help you amplify your impact. So grab your pass, turn it up, and let's make some noise. Today we're diving into HR immigration, a critical topic for businesses of all sizes. From employment-based visas and green cards, immigration policies shape your workforce, compliance requirements, and company culture. We'll break down common visa types from tourist and employment visas, unique cases for musicians and athletes, and share personal stories. I'm excited to welcome Colleen Molner, immigration attorney from Garfinkel Immigration Law Firm. Hi, Colleen. Thanks so much for being here today. We've had the pleasure of working together in depth in the past for several years. Before we get started, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Thanks for having me, Jay. It means a lot to have, and it's an honor to be your first guest. So thank you, bringing you some timely topics today. I'm Colleen, a partner at Garfinkel Immigration Law Firm in Charlotte. I'm a board-certified immigration law specialist in North Carolina and been practicing for 11 and a half years. I've always been doing employment-based immigration, working with entrepreneurs to large companies, and then also specialize currently in healthcare immigration.
What inspired you to go into law, and why did immigration law resonate with you over other areas of criminal law, corporate, or even entertainment law?
So going into law was a decision I made pretty early on. I would say I always knew I wanted to do it. I used to volunteer at the county teen court here in Charlotte as a volunteer attorney. And so I got to work with a lot of attorneys here in Charlotte, and it was something that I knew I really wanted to do and would love. And then I sort of fell into immigration law. I was interning at the district courthouse in Raleigh during college. And one of my tasks was to help with the naturalization ceremony, which was really my first exposure to immigration law. And it was really touching. It was just touching to see all the different cultures and nationalities coming together and achieving their ultimate American dream. From there, I sat down with Steve Garfinkel, who is the founder of our firm, just to learn more about what he does and the ins and outs of immigration, and stayed connected with him. And I've been here at Garfinkel Immigration ever since. Love it.
I read somewhere and saw somewhere, it's actually an immigration officer. He was giving an interview and he said that after tax law and complexity, immigration is second with how complex it is within the United States.
It is so complex. There's never a boring day. We had a partners meeting this morning. We always end it with, does anyone have any sticky situations? And one of the partners was talking about a sticky case. And at the end, we were like, well, we still learn something new every day.
Before we jump in to the complex topic of employment-based visas, could we start and touch briefly on what is a tourist visa, a business visitor visa, an ESTA? Because there's obviously misunderstanding on these types of visas versus actual work visas.
Yeah. Even though I do business immigration, the visitor visa stuff comes up a lot in our practice for this exact reason. Employers want to know if this employee can come over on the visitor visa or do they actually need a work visa? And it depends on what they're doing. The visitor visa is the B1, B2 visa. It is for the purpose of traveling to the U.S. for pleasure, like going to Disney World, visiting New York, going to California, or coming for business purposes. However, if you're coming for business purposes, the tricky part is you cannot be doing any activity that would be deemed work, which isn't defined in black and white under immigration law, which is tough about immigration law because it's very subjective and discretionary depending on who's reviewing the case. So the way we interpret work in that sense is whether it's something that it's hands-on activity or something where someone would normally be getting paid for in that type of position or activity. But coming to the U.S. on a B visa as a visitor for the purpose of meetings, observing, negotiating a contract, those are generally permissible as a business visitor. And I should say that none of this is legal advice. Just a lawyer's disclaimer. This is just general information. Yeah. It just obviously immigration advice is highly personal and based on the individual. So talk to an attorney if you need more information or want to talk through your specifics. So the visitor visa, the visa in your stamp. It allows you to come over. Some countries have visa waiver or ESTA, which you asked about. Those countries, if you're a national of one of those countries or a citizen of one of those countries, you do not need the actual visa stamp to come in as a visitor or a business visitor. You can apply for what's called ESTA. There's a registration online that you pay for, answer a few questions, go through security and get approved electronically. And you just come in on that, called the Visa Waiver or ESTA program. You can get admitted for up to 90 days on ESTA, whereas if you have the B visitor stamp in your passport, up to 6 months.
Yeah, I have family members that have a B1, B2 to come as a tourist and go see the sites like New York City and the Great Lakes of Michigan. I know it's not legal advice, but here's a question. The Consumer Electronics Show or CES or the various auto shows around the U.S., if someone came in as a tourist to see CES, that would be fine. But if they came in to work CES and their company was a global company, company A, and they're there like doing product demonstrations, that gets probably a very gray, murky area, I'm guessing.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. I'd be asking, well, what exactly are they doing when you say working the show?
Right. I'll put a link of the show notes what ESTA is, because there's numerous countries in Europe and other ones that qualify for that. This is very just informational if you're an HR professional wanting to learn more about it, if you're a foreign national wanting to learn more about immigration, or if you're just tuning in for entertainment purposes, all these links within the show notes. Speaking of ESTA, because you said, are you working? That leads to really a first story that I wanted to share with you and maybe just discuss it briefly. But in 2017, there was a band from Japan, Loudness. For you metalheads, you guys know this, but fun fact, Nikki Sixx used to be in this band before Motley Crue. They've toured the U.S. on and off for 30 plus years. In the spring of 2017, they arrived in LA to start their U.S. tour, and they were denied entry because they were using ESTA. A month prior to that, an Italian band had a very similar situation as they were invited to perform at the annual South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas. Anyone that's played in a band knows how important that festival is. They also arrived on ESTA, had a letter from their American record label explaining that they weren't being paid. It was for promotional purposes for their upcoming album. However, they were jailed overnight, had their cell phones confiscated.
Like
detained.
What? Okay.
The next day, driven back to the airport and walked to the plane, given their cell phones. And the reason is that the immigration officer said South by Southwest charges entry fees to get into the festival, which anyone that's ever been in a band and played at a festival, that doesn't mean the band's being paid whatsoever. There's a different level of band where you get paid at festivals, especially when there's so many showcases and so forth at a festival. It's hard to play coulda, shoulda, woulda. I'm just trying to think like, okay, if you work for a record label as their immigration attorney, these bands are not at levels of international stars like Iron Maiden, Justin Bieber, he's Canadian, Shakira's from Colombia. There's special visas for entertainers and athletes. And maybe we can touch on that a little bit later, because that's at a different level, getting those visa types, whether you're playing professional baseball or touring the world in and out of different countries and filling arenas versus playing clubs. So I try to think of, if I was in that band, what would I have done if I was their manager. Obviously, I think always consulting with an attorney. I'm
Yeah.
assuming your advice would be they should have consulted with an attorney at least to have a call beforehand.
Always. I mean, I think that I would try. It's hard to predict what's going to happen, especially when to you it's so clear this is not work. And I think this is more important now with, especially at the border, you know, things are getting a little more strict under our new administration. But I think packaging, I always try to take the approach of when you anticipate any sort of issues, just packaging them up with back pocket documentation to try and counter any sort of issue that might be flagged by the port of entry officer, whether it's an employment verification letter showing ties to their home country, the letter from the record label or manager really outlining and explaining what the festival is. They're not getting paid. This isn't work. So preemptively making the arguments in anticipation of what challenges they might see. But it's tough because, like I said before, immigration law, it's just so subjective and so discretionary, and it all depends on the officer you're going to have. So being prepared is the best to the U.S., honestly.
So listen up, bands, record labels, and promoters. Always consult an immigration attorney to avoid this going forward. I'll link these stories in the show notes because they're very interesting to read, whether you're just a music fan or you played in a band, or here in Metro Detroit, you try to cross into Canada on occasion to play a club. We did that once and almost created an international incident. Customs was fine. It was the immigration of us going into Canada to play. We didn't have a work permit, but we weren't being paid. We were playing pro bono. But yeah, it was interesting because the immigration officers heard us on the radio being promoted for weeks leading up to it.
And it goes both ways. I mean, not just coming into the U.S., going in other countries.
That was going into Canada, but every country has their own immigration regulations and laws we have to adhere to. I thought we could go kind of somewhat in order, is that before employment-based visas, sometimes those that get on visas, they come as a student first. So a student visa is known as the F1 visa. Maybe you could just touch base briefly on what is the F1 visa, how would one go about getting it if they're in high school in another country and they have dreams to study abroad in the U.S. and they were to convert to employment-based visa and try to work here for a couple of years just to get some experience and go home.
Student visa. It's generally used for folks who want to come to the U.S. and enroll, usually full-time, in a university with the goal of securing bachelor's, master's, or any sort of higher degree. In order to get the F1 visa, you have to be admitted into the program. Then you get what's called an I-20. You take that to the consulate. You get your F1 visa stamp in your passport, and that's essentially your permission to knock on the door of the U.S. and say, please let me in. And the officers at the port of entry have the discretion to let you in. There is very limited work authorization with the F1 visa. There's even more work authorization available to students, F1 students who are getting their degrees in a STEM field. ICE has a list of fields that qualify under STEM for purposes of getting this work authorization called STEM OPT, optional practical training. You can get that sort of work authorization for a total of 36 months, which is nice because if you don't have a STEM degree, then you are limited really to 12 months of OPT. There's also curricular practical training when you're in school, and it's usually, I consider it more like an internship. So when you're working for purposes of getting credit, a class credit or something to that effect. And that's also limited. That's only for when you're enrolled in school, whereas OPT can be used in your last year or after graduation. But it's a great way to get in the door with employers. A lot of employers do employ F1 students, usually on their OPT work authorization. And then once they have found that they're a good fit for the organization, the student employee feels the same way. That's when they are generally looking to secure a more long-term work visa to allow them to stay and work beyond the end of that OPT work authorization. And that's normally how they segue into normally the H-1B visa for specialty occupations, which you're very familiar with.
Oh yeah. It's, it's really great because on one hand, you meet some team members and they go to school and you realize, you look at their credentials, you're like, wow, this is like next level STEM, Algorithm engineers are really at a different level now. When I went to school and, for bachelor's of business administration, which is a great degree, but I never went the engineering route, mathematics or anything like that. And it's funny that STEM gets extra time because the leader of SHRM, Johnny C. Taylor, he's really big on saying focus on policy, not politics. I agree with that, but also policy is a result of politics. I remember going back to the Clinton administration, and every single administration, regardless of party, said, we are falling behind on STEM. And here we are. This is a direct result of falling behind on STEM. And again, it wasn't my path. We'll wait and see. Like, and my daughter's on her way to being at a STEM field. A lot of kids are. It's very interesting to see that, because businesses and technology are not going to wait to play catch up. They need talent now.
Right.
And how you go about that
and they're willing
is
to pay
key.
for it.
And they're willing to pay for it, to sponsor.
Yep.
We touched on the F1 and the different variations of work authorization related to F1, OPT and CPT. There are so many other work employment-based visas. There's obviously the H-1B, H-2B, with spring right around the corner and agriculture workers. There is the TN, the L1, the E2, the E3. Maybe we can, dive into these briefly. It's really, if you think about it, it's an alphabet soup of what do these letters mean, and that's not even getting into the green card side yet, which we'll get to it, in a little bit. Sure. I'll start with the H.
And the H is the one that everybody hears about in the news.
Sure.
If the news is even covering business immigration, which it rarely is. The H is the one that is the most controversial, I think, and that is heard of. It's for especially occupations. So employers can sponsor an H-1B if the position is one that, industry speaking, normally requires the minimum of a bachelor's degree, a U.S. bachelor's degree. And then the employee has to meet those requirements. There's a lot of other requirements associated with it. There's several different prongs. There was actually just a new modernization rule that was finalized by the Biden administration before Trump got into office that's supposed to modernize H-1Bs a little bit more. The issue with H-1Bs is that there's a congressional limit on the number allowed per fiscal year. So starting October 1st, the beginning of the government's fiscal year, there's a cap of 65,000 H-1Bs available for that fiscal year for individuals that have a bachelor's degree or the equivalent of a bachelor's degree. And then there's an additional 20,000 available for those who have a U.S. higher degree, so master's degree or PhD. Then you sort of have two chomps at the bit. So a total of 85,000 per fiscal year. The problem is the demand is way higher than that. Like, I'm talking in the 200s to 300s per fiscal year. So your actual chance of getting selected for processing of an H-1B, because they do a lottery since the demand is way higher than the supply, the actual chances are 30% of getting selected, which is a bummer because a lot of these students, these F1 STEM students, they don't qualify for other visas. A lot of them are from India or China. They're not from a country that has a carved out visa for them, like Canadians and Mexicans can have a TN visa.
Right. When I worked in the HR immigration team, I remember right around 200,000-300,000 people would apply every year. And then when I went to a different team within the same company, talent acquisition, I think it was 22 when the hiring boom was happening coming out of COVID. I think there was 700,000 plus one lottery year. And I guess there's been talk that they found lots of fraud and abuse. While we're on H-1B, one thing I wanted to ask you is, there's a theory out there right now, and it's been out for quite some time. When a company hires someone to be on an H-1B, they're an international student on the F1, they get into the lottery, they hit the lottery, so they get an H-1B. You have to do a breakdown of, you file it through USCIS and the Department of Labor as far as wage levels. All this is public information through the Department of Labor's website. There's something called level 1 through 4 wages. Level 1 is really your entry-level type wage, someone maybe fresh out of school. Level 4 is typically more of a senior individual with a number of years of experience, certain degrees. This is where it gets controversial, as they say, well, they pay these software engineers $30,000, so they undercut U.S. workers. We know that some companies will, of course, abuse. There's abuse in any kind of system. Obviously, following the law and being in compliance is the first thing any attorney would advise their clients to do. What are the risks? So if a company were to do that and get caught, are there fines levied against them? Are they banned from participating in the H-1B lotto going forward? Or what does that even look like?
This was part of Trump's first administration, was when a lot of this was more sort of heightened and visible. Actually, under their administration, they created this registration system for H-1Bs, which has allowed the government to quote unquote crack down more on the fraud. And if the company it essentially could jeopardize the company's ability to continue sponsoring H-1Bs, be subjected to fines. Obviously, public image is going to be a big risk if they're in that situation. We saw it with one company a few years ago where it became a big to-do after the registration and fraud activity disclosed.
What is the H-2B visa? Because this is a very different skill set as far as the workers that companies are really needing to fill roles with.
The H-2B, and to be honest, I don't have a ton of experience with H-2Bs. It's sort of like its own practice area within employment immigration. A lot of firms specialize only in H-2Bs, but there's also a quota on the number of H-2Bs permitted per year. It's really for seasonal agricultural workers. If you're familiar with the immigration green card, you're likely familiar with the perm process, which a lot of attorneys and employers grimace when they hear about perm. I don't know how you feel about it, Jay. It's time consuming to do a perm. And H-2B is very similar because it requires a lot of similar procedures that a perm requires in terms of testing, in terms of filing, similar 9089 with the Department of Labor. And It's
essentially testing the labor market to see if there's American workers willing and able to do those jobs.
Exactly. In the agricultural, seasonal sort of work.
It's very complex. Like we talked earlier, after tax law, immigration is the next most complex. That's from an immigration officer. Yeah, that's from an immigration officer on camera saying that. So maybe a CPA or a tax attorney would have a nice debate with an immigration officer, or yourself as an immigration attorney. I would actually enjoy seeing that as a roundtable one day. But information is key when you're understanding how things are going. It really helps you as a business owner decide, like, do I go down this area? Let's touch base on the TN.
The TN is based on NAFTA, the NAFTA treaty, which is called
USMCA or something.
Yeah, we all still call it NAFTA. But it's for citizens of Canada or Mexico coming in to work in a professional position. And in NAFTA, there's an appendix of professions that are eligible for it. So, for example, nurses are in it. They're engineers, certain types of scientific positions, and other medical positions. So it's really useful for Canadians and Mexicans. For example, when the student who is a Canadian or Mexican doesn't get into the H-1B, there's also crafty ways to apply for it. Canadians can just come to the border and show an employer letter and their degree or license to work, and they're admitted, which is nice.
I remember writing letters occasionally for my Canadian colleagues. So here, for those tuning in and don't know, I'm in Metro Detroit. We're a border city. We have a lot of Canadian friends and colleagues in all different industries, and there's many Canadians that cross daily or a couple times a week, and they go right to the port of entry and make an appointment with an officer. I think it's like a $70 fee as well. So that'd be a TN1, and Canadians don't have to have a visa stamp for that. But if you were a Mexican national under a TN2, you're not able to do that at the border, are you?
No, you go to the U.S. consulate in Mexico, get the TN visa stamp in your passport based on approval of all the documentation, and then present that visa stamp at the port of entry. Again, the visa stamp is for knocking on the door of the U.S. saying, I've been sort of pre-approved. Now it's up to you to admit me.
Final step, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Great.
So the process is different, but the nature of it is the same.
And there's no annual cap on TNs or anything like that, right? Okay.
Nope.
What would be the L1 visa?
The L is for intercompany transferees. This is typically used by large multinational companies. They don't have to be large, but a lot of them are large. And when they want to transfer key personnel from, their Germany office, China office, wherever it may be, as long as that employee has been working for at least 1 year within the last 3 years, they're generally eligible for the L visa. There are like subcategories of it. So for managers and executives, and then employees who have specialized knowledge. So a good example of specialized knowledge is a product engineer who might be eligible for the L1B for specialized knowledge versus the manager.
I like to think of the L1B as they might have knowledge of our secret sauce of a formula or something like that.
Exactly. The people who have patents, but not necessarily have to rise to that level of recognition and expertise.
So that's the L1A and B. What would be like the E2, and what's the difference between the E2 and the E3?
The E is my favorite visa.
Oh.
The E3 is for Australians, and it's so any citizen of Australia is eligible for the E3, and it's largely the same as the H1B. And it's weird and confusing because it's in the E category, but it's basically the same as the H1B, but there's no quota. So the E2 companies who are in the U.S., established in the U.S. based on a direct investment. The company has a nationality for purposes of the E. So, for example, if there's a startup company in the U.S. And it has a 90% owner who is Canadian, then that Canadian company can register with the consulate in Canada as an E enterprise. And then they can, as long as they've shown the direct investment by the actual Canadian owner, and that it's majority owned by the Canadian owner, and that owner or employee is in a position to direct the enterprise, then once they have it registered in that treaty country, which is what it's called because it's based on treaties with different countries, then the company is eligible to bring in any other Canadian to come work for the company. And that Canadian would go to the consulate, apply for an E2 visa based on the company's overall registration. Now, there are a lot of other eligibility requirements, both the owner and the investor and the employees, but that's the general concept of it. And I love it because once you come in on it, you get admitted for 2 years, and it's indefinite. Yes, it's a temporary visa, and you have to have temporary intent to be here, but it's easy to keep getting the extensions of that E visa without requiring a filing, so to speak. I should say too, the E could also be used for large companies that are publicly traded than small investor.
We've gone through several already. What would the O1 visa be?
The O is for individuals of extraordinary ability. If you're not someone who's won the Nobel Prize, then the next level of one ability would be someone who has reached some sort of other national or international claim in their field. So publishing in scholarly journal articles, peer-reviewed articles, presenting at conferences, contributions of major significance that are original. So again, folks who have invented things, worked in a critical capacity for the company. The standard's pretty high for the O1s. Again, if you're not a Nobel Prize winner, then the standard is pretty high, and the evidence that needs to be submitted, it has to corroborate those statements.
We've gone through several visa categories already. It's like an alphabet soup, but then we get into the EADs. So looking at this from an HR professional, they're doing new hire orientation, I-9 verification within those first 3 days, and then someone presents a EAD document, or they think someone's on an H-1B visa, but they need an EAD card as well. Or someone presents an EAD card and they're like, well, what visa are you on? Sometimes they don't realize EADs complement certain visa types, and other times you don't need an EAD. Can you just briefly explain what that is?
The EAD is an independent work permit that's, like you said, connected to some other sort of benefit request. So called an EAD because it stands for Employment Authorization Document, but it's often referred to as the work permit. Individuals who are eligible for it, generally, it means they're generally not being sponsored for a separate work visa, so to speak. So spouses of certain visa holders are eligible for an EAD. So someone who comes in on an L1, their spouse could apply for an EAD, although they do have work authorization without the actual EAD. And then, there are certain humanitarian programs that issue EADs, beneficiaries of a U visa. They typically have domestic violence or some other act of violence. If they're a victim of violence, they're eligible for the U visa. They can get a work permit. And then it also comes with your green card application. So once you've filed your green card application, at some point, since it takes forever to get a green card, at some point after the filing of it, you get that work permit to help bridge you until you get your green card, give you that work authorization until you get your green card.
I know each category of EAD, like you mentioned, I've spent many times just going right to the USCIS website and diving into, okay, this category equals this, and this is automatic renewal if they file.
And the USCIS website, it's like a dictionary of codes for the EADs, but we get asked this question weekly, I would say, from our clients.
Jumping into green cards, a company, they have someone on a visa, they decide to sponsor them, everything's going well, and an employee approaches their manager or their HR team and says, I need sponsorship. Where does a company start? How do they help determine what kind of green card this person be? Is it based on, the country of birth? How exact are there quota systems for green cards? How does all that work?
Yes and yes.
Yes.
And this is something that can be talked about for hours.
We'll have to do a part 2 or 3 someday.
In a nutshell, there are several paths to a green card. And when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about it in the employment-based path for a green card. And that employment-based path is broken down itself into several other categories called preference categories. Preference category is important because that combined with the employee's country of birth, that establishes the employee's place in line for the green card, because the green card is also based on a supply and demand system, just like the H-1Bs. And so a lot of countries are what we call backlogged, and green cards are not available. And those countries are mostly, when you hear that, it's referring to India and China, sometimes Mexico and Philippines as well. The preference category that they're in is based on the job that the employer's offering to the employee. So just because your employee is a superstar and has a master's degree does not mean they're going to be in the preference category that is for jobs requiring a master's degree, because the job is what determines that category. So if the job they're sponsoring the employee for minimally requires a bachelor's degree, they're going to be in the preference category that requires a bachelor's degree, not the one that requires a master's degree. There's always confusion with that. Employees ask us, but I have a master's degree, shouldn't I be in the EB2 preference category instead of EB3? And we have to say no, because the job being offered to you is it minimally requires a bachelor's degree. So that's what puts them in that preference category.
And the EB does that stand for employment-based green card? So employment-based 1, 2, 3, and so forth?
1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is how it's broken down. Employers generally use 1, 2, and 3. Does not require the employer to test the labor market. So there's no perm involved, which is usually the first step of the green card process. But it is for individuals of extraordinary ability. So just like the O1, it's also for multinational transfers, managers or executives, just like the L1, or outstanding researchers and professors. Whereas EB2 and EB3, they require the employer to test the labor market. Right now, that step of the process is I'm advising employers to budget for about 2 years just to get through that first step, if not more, because we have to wait on the Department of Labor to issue a wage determination to tell you how much you have to pay that worker when they get their green card. And then you have to actually test the labor market. And depending on how the labor market is, you might fail that because you might actually find a U.S. willing, able, available, qualified U.S. worker for the position.
And as far as a wage determination, I'm just going to throw out a nice round number. Let's say there's an engineer and the wage determination is, say, $100,000. The company's paying $130,000. As long as they're paying a minimum of $100,000, is that in compliance? They get paid more. They just can't pay less. They can't offer the person $75,000.
That's correct. Yep. And it doesn't have to be what you're paying the person now. It has to be when they get the green card. You are promising that you are going to be paying this employee $100,000 in 5, sometimes 10 years. The green card system it's difficult because the way it's set up, because employers are having to predict what position their sponsored employee is going to be in the future. So, and again, for these Indian and Chinese employees, they're not getting their green cards for about 10 to 12 years. It's really hard. It's the visa bulletin's not moving. I do know it's categorized, like the supply is going to be based on the preference categories crossed with the countries.
What is the national interest waiver? Like, how is that different from other like green card categories? Because some people have brought that up.
The national interest waiver has been getting a lot of attention lately because it got a little more, I guess, looser is what you could say, because extra guidance was put out there by the Biden administration that was in favor of approving it especially for folks who had a STEM degree. In this last year, a lot of practitioners and companies have been filing green cards under the national interest waiver, which allows you to bypass that labor market test, the PERM process. And it's for individuals who are in a position to advance a field of endeavor and have substantial merit in their position and contributions in their field. Like I said, in the Biden administration, this guidance was really in favor of individuals with a higher degree in STEM. We've seen a lot of filings in NIWs across the board. Immigration Service sort of picked up on it, and they've been pushing back a little bit more, especially now under the Trump administration. So we're seeing it get a little bit stricter these days, but it's otherwise a great program and a great tool to use we've been using it for our clients as a cost savings. So just get the PERM process a priority date sooner, since it's not going to take 2 years like the PERM. So if you're eligible for an NIW, I would go for the NIW.
We talked about how individuals go about getting their visas, company sponsors. You mentioned they go to U.S. Embassy if they're a student visa to apply. That visa, another topic. As far as like compliance and risk and consular processing, what is the difference between consular processing or filing through USCIS here within the United States? Keeping this from an HR point of view, like someone might not know what these are, and if maybe a team member approaches saying they need to go to their home country at Christmas. With so many policy shifts, whether it's consular processing or filing through USCIS, for employment-based immigration.
This is really going to depend on the visa type and strategizing with the employer, from my perspective, on what makes the most sense based on the employee's personal plans, but also from a cost perspective, and obviously the perspective of minimal to no disruption in employment authorization between the employer and the employee. So we tend to look at all of those factors together when we advise on whether or not it makes sense to go process at the consulate versus stay in the U.S. Under the current administration, one of the most recent executive orders was really directing officers to return to the extreme vetting practice, which they used under Trump's first administration. And what that means is they're going to look at the applications with a fine-tooth comb. Under his first administration, we saw consular officers looking at applicants' social media accounts to see if, I think you and I had someone an officer went digging through his Instagram and said, it looks like you were playing music at a cafe in the U.S. 2 weekends ago. Were you paid for that? We actually think that this might be work. And then they dig into this was unauthorized work and a violation of your status, which impacts your benefit request. So we're starting to experience some of that pushback already at the consulates, and we're expecting an uptick in that as well as we go through the next 4 years of this. It really just depends on the situation and whether it makes sense for the visa category. Some visa categories are also going to be more scrutinized than others. And if it's a routine one or renewal, or if it's one where you really have to show more in-depth eligibility, that's going to be more scrutinized, then it might not make sense to send them out and risk a denial and not being able to come back in. We're also suspecting travel bans, so also nationality is going to play a big part in this. So certain nationalities are likely going to be stuck in an extra security processing. So from an HR perspective, global mobility perspective, we're really advising companies to take a look at what the prior administration's travel ban was, identify employees who might be at risk based on those travel bans, and either don't travel, or if you have them abroad already, try and secure that transfer sooner rather than later.
because a lot of people, they realize, what does a U.S. embassy do, or a U.S. consulate? And U.S. embassy in Mexico, for example, in Mexico City, and there's several consulates spread out around other parts of the country in Mexico. And every country we have embassies all over. That's where you go. If you're a tourist in Mexico and you lose your passport, that's where you go to get your passport, reissued so you can get back home. And that's where, obviously, foreign nationals would go to apply for their visas abroad, like at a consulate or embassy you're filing through USCIS. Say you're a company, there's a lot of site visits going on right now. With increased visits and raids, mass deportations, stricter enforcement, how can companies protect themselves if they've acted lawfully but still face scrutiny? They want to be prepared. They have nothing to hide.
Being prepared, you said it. There are several different agencies that could subject you to a visit or an audit. And we're talking I-9 audits, which is usually just ICE giving you a notice and you had to produce all your I-9s in 3 days. The best way to prepare for an audit is to go ahead and do an internal spot check or audit, or hire an attorney to do a spot check on your I-9s and see if there are any common trends or issues that might compel you to go back and look at all of them or redo them if needed. Then there's also visits at the workplace by the Fraud Detection National Security, FDNS, which is a unit of Immigration Service, and HSI. They'll come to your workplace usually unannounced. And it's those types of site visits that give people a little more panic because it's an officer coming to your site visit or coming to your work site, requesting to talk to people, requesting for documentation. To be best prepared for that, we have guidance for employers to talk about it internally, designate one contact person in the event that one of those officers does come to your work site, and having that head person at your work site, talk through what the action plan would be with the immigration attorney in the event one of these officers showed up. Because a lot of that, too, is knowing where to allow the officers to go, what documentation to produce, if any, who they can talk to once they're there. I think internal training and discussion and collaboration with attorneys is going to be the best way to prepare for that, even if you do everything by the book and otherwise prepared for that type of visit. And then there are raids. I mean, that's completely different, where you generally have a lot of enforcement there. And that's where you get into knowing what type of warrant they have to go to certain places in your office building. So that's another way, or another area that I would say requires some internal discussion and training in collaboration with an attorney.
With each new administration, immigration reform often becomes a focal point for policy changes. There hasn't been any major reform since 1986 under the Reagan administration. We know a comprehensive bipartisan bill was introduced about a year ago in 2024. Obviously, it's clear something needs to change. As an immigration attorney, your firm going to conferences with other attorneys around the country, what are some areas you could see being updated if a new bill were to be introduced? Like, what would you predict really on the employment-based side?
The common desire that you hear about is increasing the H-1B numbers, and that would be great, I think, economically. And then also fixing the green card system, since we have such a backlog because of the demand and the supply. Those, I think, are things that you commonly hear about with immigration reform. And yes, I'm all for that as well. One aspect I mentioned earlier, I specialize in healthcare immigration. And I think one profession that is getting overlooked when we talk about immigration reform is nurses. There used to be a visa for nurses that predates me. I think it even predates my birth. So I don't know how it worked exactly, but it's no longer available. Since nursing is not considered a professional job, it does not fit into the H-1B category, and it doesn't fit into any other visa category except for the TN, which means you have to be Canadian or Mexican to come fill a nursing position. Otherwise, you have to do a green card for a nurse. And yes, there's a great avenue for a nurse green card, which allows you to bypass the labor market test, but the backlog is so long. I mean, I have a client with over 300 nurses over in the Philippines who've accepted offers, want to come over to the U.S. And fill the nursing shortage and gaps here in the U.S. But the green card is the visa bulletin's backlogged. So it's going to be 3 issues. And I get calls from clients all the time that they really desperately need nurses and something needs to be done to fix the nursing shortage. They want to fill it with foreign national talent. They have people overseas who are willing to do it. There's too many limitations and restrictions. I think it could do a great thing for the healthcare industry. It seems like an obvious thing to me, but
we really do have a nursing shortage, and even community colleges around the country have special programs to try to fast track people within nursing programs.
Pay for it.
Yeah, the TN. That's why there are a number of Canadian nurses that cross day in and day out from Windsor, Canada, into the Metro Detroit. The number of hospital systems right across the border here in Metro Detroit. There's prevailing wage you have to pay for H-1B. Do you see any reform? Do you see that maybe being applied to like an L visa as well, if a reform happens in this current administration?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that would require some heavy changes to the regulations, which is a long process, and it'll get challenged, every step of the way, I think. Though not particularly. There is some speculation that this administration is going to change the wage system for H-1Bs. He tried to do in his last administration, but it got challenged and it got dragged out for so long that it finally got dropped because the challenge went beyond when Biden was inaugurated. So the administration dropped it.
And do you see anything, potential reforms regarding DACA or TPS?
Reform?
Yeah, like if an immigration reform happened, like what would DACA and TPS look like? I don't think we really touched on that yet.
I don't see under this administration anything positive happening with those programs. Unfortunately, we're worried about those programs over the course of the next 4 years. Most of them are suspended right now, in fact.
We've touched on employment-based visas, green cards, workplace raids, compliance, potential reform. One thing I wanted to jump into for some fun is there's different visa types for athletes, musicians, and artists working in the U.S. I thought we could just touch base briefly because we talked about those two bands that tried to get in under ESTA, the visa waiver program, and were denied entry. I believe there's a visa called P1, the P2, and there's some other ones. Yeah. This is probably where your Major League Baseball players, basketball players, maybe FIFA, an internationally recognized group that are playing arenas, stadiums, large theaters, like your Iron Maiden, Bare Naked Ladies, Shakira, J Balvin. When they come here, obviously someone's working for the Major League Baseball. They're playing for the Detroit Tigers or Chicago Cubs. And I think I even saw at one point, I know Venezuela is a hot spot for baseball players. There's no longer an embassy in Caracas, but I remember a number of years ago, there was a picture of signing day where a lot of Major League Baseball players were all standing outside the embassy with their attorneys as they're all signing contracts to play baseball. Is there anything you could share about that?
So I'll be honest, I've personally never done a P visa. My partner, William, has done a few for Formula One drivers. I have another colleague who does them quite routinely. So I can't speak much to the P visa. I will say I know a lot of performers too could also come in on the O visa, especially if they have an agent. The O visa you talked about earlier is for individuals with extraordinary ability, and it's pretty broad. I mean, it could be used for really anyone in any industry. So I think that's also a category that's utilized by those industries quite often.
And from an HR side, is one thing I wanted to share as an HR professional is with years of experience with HR immigration, partnering with yourself and your law firm and learning all this it is so important in understanding the right visa type.
Sure.
It is essential to ensure lawful entry, activities in the U.S. Consulting with an attorney or expert
Absolutely.
is highly recommended. Again, navigating the complexities of U.S. visa options. The last thing you want to do is have a hiring manager, all from a good place, telling someone, well, I was an expat, and when I came to the U.S. 15 years ago, this is what I did. And someone maybe is denied entry into the U.S. because, again, it all came from a good place, and they didn't understand what they were giving was incorrect advice, outdated advice. Immigration reform, whether it's a large reform or just little regulations, they change a lot to stay on top of things.
Yeah, that's the thing about immigration law is it all sort of trickles down in policy, as you said. It could take a while before you actually feel the effects of it, but it could also pick up pretty quickly, also depending on what agency you're dealing with.
As we're wrapping this up, I like to do the Encore section. What's one thing about immigration law you wish more people understood but rarely do?
I always say immigration is such a hot topic that people are so strongly opinionated on, but know nothing about. I think a lot of people don't truly understand legal immigration versus illegal immigration, and
Right.
really the value and benefit that comes with legal immigration and business immigration. So, and it's a complex area to understand. That there's so much to learn about it and to know, but I think that that's probably the best start.
Like it's probably from a good place, but some people are ill-informed or not informed properly. I mean, I know someone that hated the IRS because they would pass these tax laws. And I said, Congress passes tax laws, right? It's like being mad at the cop for pulling you over, but the state legislator is the one that passed the law.
Exactly.
What's the most creative excuse you've heard for why someone overstayed their visa? They call you in a panic and say, guess what?
They didn't know.
They didn't know.
I mean, honestly, they didn't know. They didn't. And if I'm entering a foreign country, I would be very scared to not know how long I have in that country, being a little more responsible about it. So it always gets me when folks say, well, I didn't know that, my status expired. It's usually people who come on a B visa.
I remember my family, we did one large trip coming out of COVID. It was a bucket list trip, and we went to St. Martin in the Caribbean.
I remember that.
We went through the immigration process as we landed at St. Martin. I remember getting my paperwork. I can technically be here 30 days. Now, we were only staying a week. I have 30 days if we somehow, won the lottery and could, extend our stay a couple of weeks. But 30 days regardless, They want me out.
Right.
What is the strangest or most unexpected question a client has ever asked you about visas or green cards?
Me, if the immigration service takes Venmo, which just
Really?
makes me laugh. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I still laugh about that because immigration is still taking everything by paper, and it's just very archaic and in the cave days still.
Who knows? I mean, maybe Elon will have PayPal going right to immigration services one day.
Maybe. Yeah, if there's any hope, I would agree. Now is probably the only hope.
What was the last concert or show you attended?
Taylor Swift, duh.
Taylor Swift.
I went to Indianapolis, took 3 of my nieces. We had been trying for like the last year to get tickets, didn't win any of the pre-verification codes, and then used like 6 different email addresses for the second round, and finally got through. And I told my oldest niece and said, I got us the 4 tickets. And she decided to take her 2 little sisters, and it was an aunt niece trip, and it was amazing. And now my 3-year-old wants to go see Taylor Swift.
Yeah, that's great. And I remember that. And since we're talking about Ite, I will share that my daughter was fortunate enough to go, and it was a bucket list trip for her. But we had a little bit of a spin, is that we have family in Spain, and one of our cousins is a huge Swiftie, was able to score 4 tickets for the Madrid show. Now, thankfully, in the EU, dynamic pricing is banned.
Yeah.
So
it's cheaper to go.
She had tickets probably 8 months in advance, and it was my daughter's senior year in high school. So we talked about it, and we said, okay, well, here's the deal. I think it was like $160 per ticket, which is phenomenal if you think about it, like compared to what the bots get them for and try to resell them. We said, okay, well, you can go to Spain. You'll see your abuela, her grandma in Spain, her aunt, her cousins. This is your spring break. This is your graduation.
Didn't she miss her graduation too for it?
We knew the date of the concert. We didn't know the date of her high school graduation, and it got released. And we said, the way the flights are, you have to miss your high school ceremony of walking. We said, we're going to leave it up to you. Do you want to walk with your friends? The graduation ceremony was the night before the concert, and she was able to dial in and watch the webcast late at night as it was happening here in Metro Detroit. And she had her little cap with her that she wore. She may or may not have been a hot mess with allergies kicked up in Spain for some reason. But the next day, it all went away because she stood for 3+ hours and sang every song called me a couple times, FaceTime, just so I could give her a high five because I didn't go. I stayed back. But it was nice to have my daughter and wife do that as a graduation trip. Got to see a lot of family members. And the dynamic pricing is the only thing that allowed that trip to happen.
Colleagues here who made the trek over there because they couldn't get tickets here and it was cheaper.
Yeah, it's funny. I think a number of news organizations showed stories of how it's cheaper to fly to Europe, see the concert, and even make a vacation out of it than it was to go to a city in the U.S. And it's like something is fundamentally upside down with Ticketmaster pricing if that's what's happening.
Well, it was amazing. It's worth it. She's awesome. I told my sister the same thing about 3 hours straight of standing and my feet hurt. And she was like, was there really no intermission?
Intermission. I remember Larry King asked Kid Rock years ago when he was on, he said, do you do intermissions? And he goes, no, Larry, I don't do intermissions. I'm a rock musician. We don't do intermissions.
Yeah. But Taylor does it 3 nights in a row.
Yeah.
Every week. I mean, yeah.
If you were to share your Spotify playlist with me, if we were sitting next to each other and you show me your playlist, what are some artists I would find besides Taylor Swift?
It is definitely almost all Taylor Swift. I might have a little Gracie Abrams in there, who opened for Taylor Swift. Kenny Chesney is also a top favorite of mine. Those are honestly, it would just be Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift Essentials is the playlist. Yeah.
Working in immigration, I know you meet a lot of people from all over the world, and I know you've done your fair share of traveling. Hey, what's one country you've always wanted to visit because of a client or a case you worked on? It just triggered something going, I want to go there someday, and you haven't had a chance to go yet.
So Italy is my favorite country ever. I studied abroad there, and anytime I have an Italian client, I just love to try and converse back with them, and I would go back in a heartbeat. I spent a little bit of time in Germany, but I think that that's probably a country where I'd love to go back and spend a lot more time. I only went to Berlin for probably 3 or 4 days for an immigration conference, but having a German client, I'd really love to just go back and spend more time there. I think that would be my pick.
If you could create your own visa category, you got hired from an administration to help with immigration reform, what would it be and who would qualify? It could be employment-based, family-based.
Right now, I feel very passionate about the nursing shortage and having a better avenue for nurses and healthcare employers to be able to employ foreign nurses. And I just think it would kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
And healthcare touches every single person in this country.
Exactly.
Whether you wanted to or not.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. Yeah. So I think that right now, that is what I would pick. A visa for nurses is what I would create.
One last question is, what's one way immigration law could be turned into a reality TV show? I know there's already the 90 Day Fiancé, which is the K visa. Is there something that another visa category that could be a TV show or something? Or just the chaos of immigration?
I think it would be interesting to follow someone probably just through their consular interview. Like,
yeah,
from the beginning all the way to the end, or following several people through the consular interview, maybe for the same visa type or
in different regions of the world. That'd be very interesting.
Yeah.
Like show them filling out the paperwork, getting all the documents.
How the officers treat them.
Yeah. What's happening outside the embassies too? A lot of people act like they're affiliated with embassies. We know that's not a thing. There's a lot of scammers outside embassies. Yeah. I would watch that. I would help. I would help executive produce that.
There you go. Just found your next role.
Colleen, this has been such an insightful and inspiring conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And for those that want to connect with you, whether to discuss personal immigration matters, or to ensure that their company's handling things correctly, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Thanks for having me and the opportunity. I would say go to garfinkelImmigration.com. We have a contact us page that a way you can submit an inquiry to us, or on LinkedIn as well. You can find me on LinkedIn.
I'll put the website in the show notes.
It'd be great. Thank you, Jay.
If you found value in today's episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Until next time, keep rocking HR excellent.